Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Change by Design, the podcast where we shine a light on all things engineering transformation. I'm Josh Corman, head of content at Lifecycle Insights, and I'm joined once again by CEO and chief analyst, the Chad analyst, Chad Jackson. Chad, how's it going?
Pretty good. It's allergy season down here in Austin, Texas, so we are all battling that, but hey, that's okay. It's okay.
Yeah, I'll look forward. Well, I don't look forward to, but I have my own allergy battle coming in May here where I'm located in central Kentucky. So, my sympathies. I understand how much fun that isn't. And, I'll wait my turn. I'll wait my turn for May.
Well, hopefully it'll be over quick, but being in Kentucky, I'm sure it will not be quick.
Everything grows here, I think. I think that's the lesson I've learned is everything grows here. It all blooms at the same time, and it all targets my nasal passages directly. But yeah, I'm excited to talk to you today. We've got a few different topics to get into, and the first is something that I have kind of come to learn a little bit about through talking with folks in the industry. I know that you have as well. And, it's this idea that in modern engineering, right, the technology is such that we can capture everything, right? We can capture every detail of requirements and product development and the processes that go into that and how, different teams interact with that. But I know that, the utopian vision, perhaps, of some software providers, right, that literally everything can be represented, kind of in this digital thread, right? This sort of, capturing of everything that goes into that development process. But that utopia doesn't always survive first contact with the practitioners, on the ground floor who find themselves, dealing with that stuff. So, I think that contrast is interesting, right? What we know is possible, right, technologically, and what is perhaps practical, on the practitioner side of things. So, can you talk a little bit about kind of why this idea, right, is sort of germinating in your head and getting your attention at the moment, and what that gap means in practice for the people who are in these engineering organizations and trying to figure out how to proceed in this world where, like I said, everything is possible technologically, but not everything might be beneficial or practical.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to unpack there. So it started off with a LinkedIn post where it talked about the problems with spreadsheets, and there can certainly be problems with spreadsheets. The point is the context that happens outside the system in a spreadsheet is often can turn into a big problem, right? So you can make a decision without all the information, without all the context, whether that's a change order, updating a configuration of a product, funding a different and separate new product development. I mean, these types of decisions, big and small. And the original poster, who is a software developer, works for a software company, was talking about the evils of spreadsheets and that you can address it by, hey, just putting everything into, one of these IT solutions and having this 360-degree view of everything. Of course, that makes sense, right? I mean, if you're working for a software provider, you're looking for problems to solve, and this is a problem for some people, the degree to which your mileage will vary, right? How acute of a problem this really is, but they want to sell their stuff, right? So, I mean, they're always going to be pushing for this vision of this is a problem and you have to go fix it. But we had a really interesting discussion of well, not everything is going to live in that system. There's a lot of work in process stuff that is frankly just temporary. It's a tool or an instrument you can use to make the decision. You make the decision, you move on. So the question that we landed at is, or the answer we kind of landed at was, okay, you don't want nothing in the system, right? Because then you have no context. And you're not going to get to everything, right? Because that's way too much bureaucracy and friction as part of the product development process. So where do you land on the continuum? Somewhere in between. And that will vary greatly by organization. It depends on what they really want to capture, what's really important for context. Yeah, of course, there's big implications for AI, but I'd love to get your perspective on that before we move to that one.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, not to put you too much on the spot, can you give an example of one of these kind of in-process decisions that might exist and live outside of that system, but that, is kind of a transitory element of this development prospect or, process where you make that decision and kind of move on, and it doesn't really rise to the level of we have to capture this along with everything else in the system.
Yeah, absolutely. So a really good example is the way the change process works, often called the, ECO process, engineering change order, is that you have a bunch of problems logged against your product. And the idea is you can swoop in and take a group of those and address it with one proposed change order, right? So you're addressing similar or maybe adjacent ones all together at once. So figuring out what problems you want to group together into a bundle to address that, there's actually a lot of iteration you could explore. You could, okay, we're gonna do 1, 3, and 5. Okay, no, what if we did 1, 4, 6, and 7? So you do a lot of this what if type of scenario stuff. And some people may want to have all those iterations, all those options as a historical trail to the development of the change order. Other people are like, listen, I just did that once. I don't want to go through the effort of documenting that somewhere in an IT system. So that's a type of like temporary work in progress, artifacts that you may want to keep it, you may not. And it really depends on your organization.
So when you say, it depends on organization, is it, complexity of the products you're developing, or maybe the size of your organization and how many hands, right, are touching this process as it goes through? Because I don't know if this is accurate, but it feels like maybe a smaller operation where you can go over to Jim's desk and, have this conversation and kind of capture that stuff, as opposed to Jim is in another building, right, at this larger enterprise. And so to do that, the convenience level, it maybe does rise to that. Okay, it's worth the documentation because the alternative is even more time and, effort kind of put into doing that.
Those are great examples. So I think it can vary greatly by product complexity. If there's a lot of intersecting domains that typically don't talk to each other, coordinating across a change like that, or any type of decision like this, anytime you have disconnected stakeholders, I would say. So there's organizational complexity, there's product complexity. There's other things like regulatory compliance. For certain industries, you really do need to document your decision-making process along the way because you could get audited. There's lots of other factors. There could be industry-specific stuff. Right. So the DoD might want to see your decision-making process of why you put this thing in a prototype and not these things in a prototype. Right.
Yeah.
So there's lots of factors and it's all legitimate, but I think it really does kind of land somewhere in the middle in reality. But again, with AI, we'll talk about that in just a second. But that's why there's a spectrum. Right. And it varies depending on where you're at.
Yeah. And that makes sense. And I think, it sounds consistent with some of the other things that we've talked about, on the show the past few weeks of the mileage varying, organization to organization, and that it is finding, a balance between, it's similar to our value and risk conversations, right? What value are you getting by leaving this trail in place? And like you said, sometimes that's because internally you want to track and measure, and you might have stakeholders who need to, or that there's value in coming in and looking at that 360-degree view of at least some of the information. But sometimes it's put upon you by an outside organization. Like you said, if you've got safety or, intelligence, kind of restrictions on, on what you do, or there's just a really high standard of review for, making
Yeah.
sure that you're doing things up to the specifications of one of these outside organizations. So, it does sort of feel like it fits and is another one of these questions, right? That each organization is kind of trying to find that, what is that tipping point where you hopefully can optimize the value and not have, and I don't know how big a risk having too much information is, but it is an effort and time, and
Yeah.
money consideration to spend, any amount of your, engineering effort on stuff like that.
Yeah. For sure. Absolutely. All
So let's
those
jump
things
into
come into
the
play.
I was just going to say, so now let's jump into AI. I can tell that
Oh, yes.
you're ready to go in. So how does that come in, right? We've talked about AI in various,
Yeah.
areas of engineering and where it's going to go. How does it fit here?
So there's this vision. A lot of people have this vision around how you can have agentic AI participate in the product development process. So you could imagine it in PLM, you could have an agent, something that's working autonomously, going around and maybe doing different things to you for you, routing things, making decisions, that kind of thing. But if you think about it, you need material to train any kind of agent on.
Mhm.
And in this case, we just talked about to what degree do you document how you make decisions? Um, and do you get all that stuff into a PLM system? And I think this is where, if we're somewhere in the middle of that continuum, or maybe the lower side of that continuum, and maybe even the higher side. See, I don't even know how much material you would really need to train an agent on. But if it's not everything, there are going to be gaps, that information gaps, decision making gap examples around that the AI cannot be trained upon.
Mhm.
So there is a problem on that front, right? So if you really want an AI agent to be a stakeholder in your product development process, working autonomously, you kind of do need to expose whatever the context is, whether it's the
Mhm.
change process, regulatory compliance, verification and validation, whatever the context is, you kind of need to expose as much of that decision making process as possible to the AI for training. But again, this comes back to feasibility. Like, how much friction do you want to introduce into the process? And how much value is an AI agent gonna deliver back to you after you put in all this work?
Mhm.
So there's a lot up in the air. Um, and I don't know where it's gonna land, but it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, I came across something the other day, and I think the source of it was IBM, and I think it was dated 1979. It was part of one of their, company kind of guidebooks, and it was very simple. A machine cannot be held accountable, therefore a machine should never make a decision.
Oh,
And now we are, technologically speaking, light years from 1979. But, as
yeah.
you were talking, I think part of it is the appetite, like you said, the appetite for friction, the appetite for the exploration process of figuring out how much value can this deliver, and also your appetite for exposing your decision-making process and the factors that might go into that. And then what are you realistically expecting that AI stakeholder, right? I love the way you put that, because it sort of feels that way, right? We have this other force, right? It's source of input, and it's giving us some
Yeah.
feedback. How much stock do we put in that, right? Is it to get a sense of maybe there are gaps, or how is it being used? And I think, we talked last week about, planning ahead in 2 or 3 years, what competencies are you going to need? And it feels like there's a similar sort of almost blindness to,
Yeah.
where could this go and how much value is there in investing in it today and trying to figure out if it can play a meaningful role and provide that value that you're talking about. And I think because it feels like we're right at the frontier of asking these questions and trying to find the answers to them, that there's probably going to be a lot of like looking around, for, okay,
Yeah.
what is the right way to do this? And there are no straightforward, easy answers because we're the, people doing the exploring, right? We're at the leading edge of it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's absolutely true. I mean, there is a lot to figure out. I think, well, I've seen a lot of prognosticators dub 2026 as the year where AI finally really gets traction.
Mm.
I think in general here at Lifecycle Insights, we're a little bit of skeptics, I would say. That's kind of how I'd, uh, hopeful skeptics. Let me put it that way. You're all about engineering transformation, but technology being the only solution that really matters, I'm very, very skeptical of those types of stances. And I see issues like this that is going to be a significant obstacle to AI finally getting traction, delivering a ton of value, because it's just not there, and it's going to require significant change. So maybe I'll be wrong, right? And it'll work out perfectly. But there's a long way to go, I think, and we're gonna find out.
Yeah, yeah, it does. To refer back to something I mentioned earlier about the utopian idea. I think if you're on the hopeful side of things, you are hoping that, right, this can be something where you get that kind of clear, immediate value where there's no question, right? It's not, oh, is this helping us? That moment of breakthrough will come. Traditionally, the horse and then the cart. We may be
Yep.
conflating those two at the moment. I'm not sure 2026, but if you're a hopeful skeptic, I'm skeptically hopeful. Maybe, I don't know. I'm leading with the skepticism. But I think that when that breakthrough happens and when you do start to see companies making real headway and finding the value in it, that the tumble down effect after that will happen, I would imagine, pretty quickly, right? That once those things kind of are proved out to at least some extent, that that there will be kind of a rush to get there, right, and to kind of add that functionality to your processes. Yeah, fascinating. I'm sure that it will. This is the third of every episode that we will mention the letters AI this year. I think if we get through an entire one without saying it, I would be shocked. I'm not sure that we can place bets on that, but if I would, I think that's where I would lean. But we can switch gears because, we can switch gears to, I know, what is one of your favorite topics in the world, which is our research that we have kind of continued to dig into. And, we talked last time about the relationship between success of engineering initiatives and the disruption or the resistance that you might face and likely will face as part of that, and how that can really, be a value. But another thing that we dove into was asking people who are in these change agent roles in engineering organizations what their responsibilities look like, and kind of how they came to that point in their career where they were acting in some way as a change agent. So can you talk to us a little bit about, first, what were we kind of asking people, in the first place? And then what did we learn about how these roles tend to be constituted inside of engineering organization?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And by the way, usually the first half of every single podcast episode where we do an interview on this Change by Design, when I'm interviewing a practitioner, I ask about, well, how'd you get to this point? How would you define a change agent? Are you a change agent? So we have a lot of anecdotal evidence too, but this study was a really good way to capture quantitative statistical findings around what are those responsibilities. So we had 188 change agents that took the survey out of 300. So we wanted like a balance between change agents and non-change agents to see if the change agents had rose-colored glasses on around initiatives. So we're going back to 166. So what we found was, and we asked that question of what responsibilities do you have? A bunch of design and development ones, some IT ones, some change agent ones. And what we found was 57% of all those change agents had a mix of change agent responsibilities, IT responsibilities, as well as design and development responsibilities. So, wow. Two podcast interviews I did this week with both people from aerospace defense. I asked them, okay, you see yourself as a change agent, you have change agent responsibilities. Do you get to do that and that's it? Or do you have to stack it on top of other stuff? And they said, no, you got to stack it on top of everything else you're doing. So your design and development responsibilities don't go away. The IT responsibilities are in there as well as the change agent responsibilities. So 57%, the majority are doing all three of those things. And, these are our people, right? This is our tribe. And I feel for them because they're carrying a significant load. So this is going to be our mission to have more findings, have more insights, more best practices to help this crew. 34% said that they have change agent responsibilities and design and development responsibilities, but no IT responsibilities, right? So driving change about how things are getting done while you're in the middle of a product development project or program. So very similar thing. Our crowd doing a lot, right? Our tribe that's doing a lot. Again, we want to help with that. So that left only 9% that are not doing that. So 7% are exclusively change agents. 2% have change agent and IT responsibilities. So very, very small. When I've talked with those folks in aerospace and defense, and we're going to be doing more automotive podcast interviews, we're going to explore this there too. There's a significant need for change agent responsibilities in these projects and programs. And these people that are filling the roles of all three or some portion, some mix of those responsibilities are overwhelmed. There's not enough time in the day to fulfill all those responsibilities to the degree that it would deliver value and mitigate risk is kind of how I would say it. So that's the framing. It's the reality that these change agents have to live with and work in. We will develop guidance for executives. We're going to be doing a little bit of benchmarking around what are the success rates of initiatives spread out across this mix of responsibilities, right, for these respondents. We'll see how that turns out. We are going to be developing guidance for executives to say, okay, that's a good idea or a bad idea to overload someone with all these responsibilities. So it's a fascinating look at something that's pretty foundational to us. We're going to continue to explore it long-term.
Yeah, and I think that idea, that number, right, 91%, right, I think is what it adds up to, that have, at least two, and often, like you said, more than half, three hats, right, that they're wearing and trying to balance those things. And, when you hear that, and then as we talked previously about resistance, right, and how often, companies say that they encounter extreme or high levels of resistance. Well, if your employees are all doing three jobs, I can imagine that, you do have to kind of battle through that. And it's not even a matter of that person's perspective or their attitude about the change. It's hours in the day, right? And how they can actually spend their time, and so it might be kind of pushing them to their limits. And so, it's not surprising to hear that. I know anecdotally, a word you love to say, which I hadn't heard before and have adopted myself, is voluntold, right? You've been voluntold that this is going to be a responsibility. And we talk about the double-edged sword of a lot of this stuff. And in this case, it's that by proving yourself in some capacity, right, that you've been involved in a change initiative and you've shown an ability to kind of get to the outcome and achieve success,
Yeah.
you are handed more responsibility because you've earned the trust of people who are accountable to those outcomes. But the end result is that you are probably doing design and development work, and now you've also been handed this added responsibility. And so being in that position, even if it's something you want to pursue and you want to make part of your career, there is a real challenge that, even a
Yeah.
strong change agent with the right capabilities faces, because you kind of have to balance that. Do I want to stack these things on top of my responsibilities? So it will be really interesting to see, how anecdotally that bears out. But then, like you said, these benchmarks specifically, are there a lot of functions that people find themselves when you do this well in design or development, you also kind of have these change agent responsibilities. And if we can get a little bit of a more granular understanding, I guess, of how those things are related, it'll allow us to do some of
Hmm.
what you're saying, right? It was just give some of that guidance and say, here's kind of what we run into. So yeah, I think, I'm a stats nerd as well. I joke that, your favorite thing is research, but I love looking at those things, and those numbers are, I can't say shocking, because, we've talked to enough people that anecdotally we understand they're overwhelmed and that there's a lot of burden on there. But it's still eye-opening, right? To see that
Yeah.
very few people have the opportunity to step back and look and at the big picture and devote their efforts entirely to the process of a successful change initiative, right? I know,
Yeah.
you and I talked to somebody from an aerospace company not that long ago, very large enterprise, who does have a team, right, that might kind of handle that
Yeah.
and might be dedicated. But it's a massive, massive enterprise, and most companies are not operating with those kind of resources. And so these positions tend to be tacked on, I think, very often, rather than, their own role.
I agree. Yeah, it's a tough position to be in. But yeah, a lot of times people don't invest in. Before we talked about competency, right? On
Mhm.
prior podcasts, we talk about a battery development competency, or, a configuration management competency. Well, change initiatives are another competency
Mm.
that you have to have in your organization in some way, shape, or form. Everybody's changing right now. It's a volatile time. So investing in that change management competency internally is really important. And that's people, process, and technology. That part of it has not changed. But
Mhm.
yeah, I feel like we're right on the precipice of really digging into this and learning a whole lot more. As a matter of fact, I think we're going to have a publication focusing on the life of a change agent and
Mhm.
how that varies depending on where you are and what you do and what your responsibilities are and all that kind of thing. So, um, looking forward to that.
Yeah, yeah, and as we find that stuff out, we will once again let Chad get a re-explain those findings on future episodes. So yeah, um, to change gears one more time, something we talked about not long ago, which was a concept that I'm, as a lot of this stuff is stuff that I'm learning about for the first time. But the agile development process, which is something that you helped me understand, kind of originated on the software side of
Mhm.
things, but has
Yeah.
grown and evolved, and there's more of an interest and an effort in applying that same kind of methodology to hardware. And I want you to talk a little bit about the connection between that and frequent prototyping. I know we've discussed before that engineers really like to have their ducks in a row before they put something physical out there to be tested and shown off. But that there may be kind of a shift in that causes those engineers to have to adjust their process or their expectations around that a little bit. So talk through this idea of agile for hardware, and why that idea of frequent prototyping might be something that gains
Yeah.
traction.
Yeah. So the idea there is that, if you're using an agile development process for hardware or software, you have sprints. And a sprint is a time boxed um, space of time, 1 week, 2 weeks, whatever it's going to be. And you say, okay, we're going to try and get through a backlog of features or development activities. And at the end of that, traditionally, you have a prototype that you build, like a functional prototype, like you put it down in front of a user and actually like, okay, let's see how this goes. And they actually try to use it. So it's been very successful on the software side of things, especially when you're working with minimal viable products, MVPs. But because so much software is showing up in today's traditional industries, automotive, aerospace, defense, heavy equipment, med device, they, in an effort to reconcile hardware software integration, which is a significant problem today. As a matter of fact, in one of our recent studies, we found that was the biggest challenge in modern product development, hardware software integration. So they've tried to adopt more agile approaches. In frequent prototypes, a prototype at the end of every sprint is one of those practices. As a matter of fact, we have another really good podcast episode with Guy Zur at Cariad. Cariad is this verification and validation company that works with Volkswagen Group. So they do verification, they do V&V for all of Volkswagen Group, essentially. And what he has done is he's applied this approach of, listen, let's build a prototype as early as possible and then do it at this frequency. And it is very difficult, I think, for everyone involved, because it's human nature to not want to put an unfinished thing in front of eyes that are going to scrutinize it. Right? It's valid and legitimate to have some anxiety around that. But what they found was, and from other interviews, what we found is that there's so many more learnings. Okay. We flashed the software, we plugged in power, we pushed, we booted it, we tried to boot it up, it wouldn't boot. Oh, okay. There's a terminal that was off. Okay, you learned something, right? Or some other issue. We use the different communication protocol between these, two electronic modules. Okay, you find that out, you get a learning, you resolve it, but also you can put it in front of your end customers and say, okay, what do you think of this feature? What do you think about this feature? Oh, you don't care about that one at all? Oh, well, we can cut that now and shorten our development schedule and focus on what really matters, right? So there's so many practical uses for frequent prototypes. And I think the thing that we all have to kind of wrap our heads around here, especially those that have been in the hardware space for a long time, is reconciling that with a digital first strategy. And for the last 20 years, we've talked about shift left, use simulation earlier, right? And don't build a prototype until the very end. And because you've been simulating, you expect it's going to pass. I think that's worked well from a hardware only perspective. Northrop Grumman talks about this pretty emphatically. They have a big public campaign that talks about it. But I think the integration of software and hardware is still such a stumbling block for so many companies. Identifying and resolving those issues, they're just trying to figure out a way to do it. Not like the optimal way to do it, but they just want to be able to do it. So I think that's come around, and I think we are going to have to reconcile this frequent physical prototyping with a digital first verification approach.
Yeah. And that's something that I know that you've talked to a lot of people about. The more software driven functionality exists on products, I imagine the more complex those integrations become. And so, it's hard there are not too many industries where you're going to be able to escape that, right? The encroaching sort of scope of software and the role that it plays in the functionality of your product. So it's not a new problem, but it causes trouble enough that, like you said, it might warrant sort of a little bit of a reevaluation of that process and whether it actually makes sense to prototype a little bit more rather than trying to nail it digitally the first time, which, ideal world, that would happen. But as we know, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. This is the second time I've used that in one episode. And I think something that engineers are probably pretty sure of, pretty sure of themselves. But, it's interesting, speaking of podcast episodes, the Guy Zor podcast, to give people a little peek, next week that will be up. So you'll be able to take a listen to that and get, kind of a deeper dive into what Guy was talking about there. But I know that, recently you had talked to, we put out a podcast episode with Nikki McGinn, who was talking about emotional intelligence, and she's an expert on that side. I'll cleanly paraphrase what she said as, she's a big fan of ugly first drafts, right? When it comes to change initiatives, get it out there and get that input. And what you're describing sounds to me like a way to bring that kind of thinking to engineering and product development, where by putting that in front of stakeholders, putting that prototype out there, seeing what works, what doesn't, what feature might not actually be that relevant, and what really is core to what they want out of it, it feels like it also increases that sense of buy-in. You're pulling those stakeholders into the process earlier. And like you said, you're able to kind of work in work in their feedback and what they're bringing to the table much earlier on. And you're able to make decisions and cut things and make those things, you're kind of getting bigger leaps forward, right? At each step of that process, by doing that way. Not the way that engineers may be used to working, but if that paradigm shift can kind of occur, and the comfort level and some of that anxiety you talked about can be, hopefully you prove it out and you see like, wow, this really did work. And over time, maybe that anxiety is reduced a little bit, right? Because you've got the outcomes that people can say, we really did get to point B a lot more quickly the second time around. So, engineers may not be a fan of ugly first drafts, but it sounds like there's some value in taking that approach. And, people say this in different ways. Make it exist first, then make it good. Fail fast, right? There are different business, kind of books and processes and terminologies, but it all gets back to that same thing of learning as early in the process as you can, and then being able to apply what you've learned going forward.
Yeah. I think for those that try it and experience it, I think they find that they like ugly first prototypes far more than end of development chaos, because it's what you get. You get a nasty failure at the end of development. You're scrambling around. You're already highly constrained because everybody else has done their design and development work. You can't violate those interfaces. So yes, it does require some adjustments. It does require some, discomfort. You can put it that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and once again, gets back to this thing we bring up all the time, which is value versus risk, right? And that risk of end of development chaos, right? And the costs that can be associated with that, because I think the digital first, like, oh, you're going to save money because you're not going to be building prototypes and doing that physical, and that is a cost. But weighing that against what you can run into at the end and the risk that presents, right, suddenly makes that decision a little bit more balanced.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree.
So speaking of value and risk and how we can hopefully help people make some of those evaluations, right? I know that you want to talk a little bit more. We mentioned last week, what's coming up kind of on the sooner side in terms of our resource library and our community forums, but the other kind of pillars of Insight EX, right? The platform that we're building to do some of what you've described and helping folks make these difficult decisions. The founders program and the advisory councils and the roles that the people who are part of those groups will play in this, I think, is going to be really important to us and kind of how we target things and how we approach it. So talk a little bit about those two pillars and why they're so important to what we're trying to do.
Yeah, absolutely. So two really, really important programs. So here in the next couple weeks, I'd say by the end of January, maybe the first week of February. Soon, we're going to be opening up the platform to the founders program. And this is going to be a select number. I think it's around 50 people that we're going to give early access to it. And the role here is important in that they're going to be providing feedback about the platform, but also what do we do in the future, right? What are the features of the platform in the subscription? And what I mean by that is, what topic areas, we talked a lot about MBSE and MBD so far. What do we do next, right? Do we want to look at software engineering? Do we want to look at, EE architectures and the development approach there? So topically, what direction do we go? And that'll influence research. Should we look at features that are more along the lines of what's in the platform itself? So do we want online assessments really, really soon? Or is that not as important as EE architectures, right? Or an AI agent to help you summarize a 30-page report that we have in the resource library. And then there's other things like when I talk about features, and another example might be live events.
Mhm.
Like we may start we're definitely going to have workshops in 2026, but how soon do we do it? And where do we start? Do we go to Detroit first or Boston? What is the main topic there? Who's going to host us at their headquarters? All those types of things. So the Founders Program, they're going to be acting as an input mechanism for our plans around features of the subscription and platform. And that's going to be really, really good. I'm looking forward to that. And it's a low lift, right? So that'll be through the forums. We'll be having lots of conversations there. The advisory council is a little bit different in that, we're going to have different levels of advisory councils with different focuses, but in general, it's going to be around a dozen people for each council. We're going to have quarterly meetings where we get together and it's non-public. We talk about the same topics. And they will provide more intimate input into what we do and when we do it. So that's going to be a lot more of really thinking even in this direction, in group and individual conversations. We'll still have forums for each one of those advisory councils, but it's going to be more of a mix of calls and discussions in the forums. So that's where we're at.
Gotcha. Yeah. Exciting to roll that stuff out. And I do love hearing firsthand from people, right, who are knee deep in all the stuff that we talk about every week. And, the idea that is really what fuels direction and, what we provide in terms of services, because we want to be part of that providing value and minimizing your risk. And that really does mean, I think, listening, right, at that and learning, right, at that kind of basic level. And I know that that's something that, that we take really seriously. And I'm looking forward to having these conversations and and just seeing where we're going to go next, because as you say, it could go in many directions.
It could. Yeah.
It really could, because there is so much, right, sort of facing every person who's in these kind of positions today.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, to that point, we want to be research driven. That's one kind of principle that we have. So for example, looking at the finding we just talked about earlier, right, where 57% of change agents have IT responsibilities and design and development responsibilities. Well, that's really going to drive how we develop resources for them, right? So we want to be research driven on that front. We also want to be community driven. So we can have lots of very straightforward, direct conversations around what do you need next to be successful? Is a workshop better than us doing research into EE architectures, right? Help us make that decision. we very much want to be community driven that way too.
Yeah. Take the assumption out of the game, right? It's not us guessing at what might be important, right? Listening to folks on the front line and get a sense of that. So excited for what's coming up on the advisory council and founders program side. Like I said, we will be putting more podcasts out. We'll this by the time this goes out later this week, Geyser's podcast will be up. So as Chad referenced earlier, give that a listen to kind of learn more about what he is doing, and that agile for hardware, frequent prototyping piece of the conversation. So excited for that. Chad, thanks as always for the conversation. I once again learned a lot, and we'll catch you next time.